Flutter. Flutter is a tool. Flutter is a tool that allows you to build native cross-platform, and that means for iOS and Android, apps with one programming language and code base. So let's have a closer look at this nice sentence here. Important is that we build native cross-platform apps. So we build both an iOS app and an Android app. We're not building a web app that runs in the browser. We're not building an app that gets wrapped by native apps. We build real apps, two different kinds of apps in the end for iOS and Android, which you then distribute through the different app stores. So through the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. That's what you get as a result. Now you get there by using one programming language so that you don't have to learn two different programming languages, one for iOS and one for Android. Instead, you have one programming language, Dart, but I'll come back to that, and also one code base. So you work in one project, you write your code once, and you still get two different apps as a result. And that's the cool thing about Flutter. You only learn one programming language, you only write your code once, and you get two apps. Without Flutter, you would normally build an iOS app by writing some Swift or Objective-C code and using the iOS development environment. And for Android, you would be using Java with the Android framework, or you would be using Kotlin and also the Android development environment. And you would have to learn all these different languages and tools. And you would have to write two totally different apps or work in two totally different projects. And with Flutter, that's not the case. One programming language and one code base. If we have a closer look at Flutter, though, it's actually a combination of things. The term Flutter refers to two major things. One is a SDK, a software development kit. You could say a collection of tools that allows you to write one code base or use one code base with one programming language. Because it includes tools to then compile this code, which normally would not run on iOS and Android, into native machine code that does run on these platforms. Because if there would be one programming language that would work on both platforms, we wouldn't need Flutter, but there isn't. Now therefore, the one programming language Flutter uses doesn't work on iOS and Android, so it needs to be compiled to native machine code for iOS and native machine code for Android, so that we have code that does run on these platforms. And that compilation task, along with a couple of other things, that's all part of Flutter. But of course, it's not just a collection of tools. It also gives you everything you need to create beautiful applications. It gives you a framework, a widget library for that one programming language, which is called Dart, which you can use to build beautiful Flutter apps. And that's what we will spend the majority of time with, of course. It gives you a vast collection of reusable UI building blocks, these so-called widgets. So these are things like buttons, tabs, text inputs, drop-downs. You get all of that out of the box. You can style them and customize them, and then you build user interfaces with these tools. In addition, you get a couple of utility functions and generally some packages that help you build what your users see and what your users interact with. And then that code which you build with the help of that framework, that is then compiled to native machine code with the help of the SDK. So that is what Flutter is. Now, as I mentioned, Flutter uses a programming language called Dart. Dart is a programming language which is focused on building front-end user interfaces, front-end apps. It's not limited to building mobile apps, that's just what Flutter uses it for, but Dart is independent of Flutter, and you can also build web apps with Dart. But we'll not focus just on Dart here, we'll focus on Flutter and how it uses Dart. And Flutter uses Dart mostly for building mobile apps. So it's a programming language built to make it really simple to build front-end user interfaces. It's a programming language which was developed by Google or is developed by Google, just like Flutter. So these are actually two independent teams in Google, but of course they're working together to improve each other. And therefore we have a hand-in-hand solution here. And in case you already have some programming experience, it's an object-oriented and strongly typed language. And its syntax is a bit like a mixture of JavaScript, Java, C#, but you don't need to know any of these languages. And actually you don't need to know anything about programming to follow along. In this course, I will teach you Dart from scratch along with Flutter. So we'll build Flutter apps and you'll learn Dart and the features you're using there along the way, because I think that's the most fun way of learning that programming language and already see nice results, the apps we're building. So Flutter and Dart are not really alternatives, instead they're working together. Flutter builds up on Dart. It's a framework for Dart, and Dart actually is the programming language which we're using. Flutter then just is a collection of tools, a set of features, utility functions, and these widgets which are implemented using Dart so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel there, but you can write your own Dart code and use these existing widgets in your code so that you don't have to, again, reinvent how a button should look like and work, but use the pre-built button instead and then just customize it to your requirements. That's how this works. And in addition, as mentioned, Flutter also gives you that SDK, so all these tools for compiling your code in the end. So now that we know what Flutter is, or that we at least have a rough idea about that, let's have a look at the architecture of a Flutter application. And there, the most important thing, which you'll see over and over throughout the course, is that Flutter has that idea of building user interfaces as code. That's called UI as code. You build a widget tree in your Flutter apps, and I'll come back to that in a second. In the end, the idea is that you will have no visual drag and drop editor for adding buttons or text inputs to your screens to what the user sees. Instead, you'll work only in code. We'll write everything in code, and whilst this might sound intimidating at first, you will see that Flutter has a really nice approach for that, which makes creating interfaces with this UI as code approach a breeze. Now, besides this core idea of how you build your apps in Flutter, this UI as code approach, it's also important to understand that Flutter apps do actually embrace platform differences whilst being based on one code base. So we work in one project, but we will still have the ability to create different user interfaces at some points or in some parts of our app if we need it for the different platforms. Because Android and iOS are not exactly the same. They're not just for different phones. They do have some small differences, and sometimes it doesn't matter to you, but if it does, Flutter gives you the tools to find out on which platform you're running, so that if you're on Android, you can execute code A, and if you're on iOS, you can execute code B. So Flutter gives you the full flexibility there. Now let's first of all have a look at that widget thing again. In Flutter, everything's a widget. That's important to understand. If you had an app that looks like this, then this is a bunch of widgets. For example, here, the app bar at the top with the tabs in there, that's one huge widget with a lot of smaller widgets in there. And all these elements on the screen are just widgets in the end. You build your entire screen, your entire app from such widgets. Actually, the whole page is a widget, and even the whole app is wrapped in one main widget. And a widget, as you will see throughout this course, is really just a code snippet, an instruction you place in your code. Something like, please render a button here. That's a widget. It'll be as simple as that. And your entire app is therefore built as a widget tree. You have this root widget, which is your app itself. Then you might have different screens there. On the different screens, you have different sections, and in there you might have text inputs, text outputs, buttons, tabs, drop-downs. And a widget might hold other widgets. For example, your tabs widget might hold individual tab widgets. But thinking about this in an abstract way can be really difficult, and therefore for now, just keep that term widget tree in mind. We'll have a look at how this works and how this looks, and we'll actually write all the code for that together throughout the course. Now, this UI as code concept is also important. If you had an application that looks like this here, then, as I mentioned earlier, you don't build it by dragging and dropping elements into a visual editor. You have no visual editor indeed. Instead, you only work in code. The code for this could look like that here. And here you already get a brief preview at how these widgets work and how you structure your entire app with the help of these widgets, how you configure your app with these widgets. And as you can see, even without understanding that code, that probably doesn't look too difficult. In the end, here we just have a bunch of instructions on what should get rendered on the screen and how the different things are related. And of course, you'll learn all about that throughout the course. So this is an extremely straightforward way of building your app, and I will introduce you to this approach carefully, step by step. We'll build our apps from scratch, and I will introduce you to the core widgets and how they work together step by step in this course. Now, this one code base thing or concept is also important to understand. In the end, you will have a bunch of Dart files in your project, and these will make up your application, and you build an Android and an iOS app based on the one project. But as I mentioned, if you need to, you can still find out on which platform you are running and then render different content based on that platform. So these are the core Flutter ideas. Again, if they're not 100% clear at this point, that's normal. We just started. We'll of course use all these features and go through all these features step by step as we progress through the course. Now, how does Flutter and Dart therefore then work internally? How is your Flutter app actually converted to a native app which can be published to the app stores? Well, you have your Dart code, which uses the Flutter framework, or the Flutter API as I call it here, which stands for Application Programming Interface. In the end, that just means that Flutter gives you a collection of functions, of widgets, which you can use in your code to build the interface you want to build. So you have your own widgets in your own code then, composed of that set of built-in widgets or your own widgets, which you can also build. And you want to build for Android and iOS. Now, as I said, Flutter simply compiles that Dart code to native code for these different platforms. And that happens with the help of the Flutter SDK. And as a result, you get real apps spit out with highly optimized, high-performance code that's based on your code, but that's not your code itself. Instead, it's a compiled version of that code. And therefore, you really ship code that runs on the different platforms and that's optimized and high performance. Because performance is actually a huge advantage of Flutter apps. Flutter out of the box gives you high performance applications. Now, in case you worked before with, let's say, React Native, which is kind of an alternative to Flutter, and I'll come back to this in a second, it's important to understand that Flutter does not use platform primitives. Now, what do I mean with that? We're having our Flutter app and we're targeting iOS and Android. Now, if we want to add a button, then in Flutter, with this UI as code approach, we do so by adding a raised button. Now, this is just an instruction in your Flutter code which tells Flutter to render a button in that part of your widget tree. Now, you could think that what happens when the code gets compiled to that native code is that this raised button is translated to, hey, iOS, please give me your default button, which would be a UI button element in the iOS development world, and for Android, a widget.button, that we get these native buttons, which are of course part of the native development environments. And that's not what happens. Instead, Flutter has its own implementations because Flutter, and that's really important to understand and to keep in mind, directly controls every pixel on the screen. So Flutter does not compile your code to some native equivalents or native alternatives. Instead, Flutter ships with its own engine, which controls the entire screen, everything the user sees, and renders every pixel on its own. And that gives Flutter a lot of control and a lot of flexibility. Now, you don't have to care too much about that because Flutter does it for you, but it's important to be aware of that because that gives Flutter more control and less limitations, and therefore you implicitly, indirectly benefit from that. You have a good performance, you have a lot of power, a lot of things you can configure, you have full control over how you want to build your user interface. So now that we have a basic idea about what Flutter is and how it roughly works, it's important to understand how Flutter is versioned. Flutter is relatively new. It's been around for a couple of years, but especially over the last year, it got a lot of traction and is really pushed by Google now. And therefore, Flutter versions are changing frequently. Now, this does not mean, however, that Flutter changes all the time, that everything about Flutter changes all the time. Instead, indeed, Flutter actually is pretty stable. And the core API, the core features, which you therefore also learn about in this course, will not change. Instead, new versions bring bug fixes, smaller improvements, often also some behind-the-scenes changes, which you don't even see, and maybe also some new niche features. So maybe some new features which you don't directly need in your app, or which now allow you to implement something in a different way than you did it before, but your old way also still works, but you could now also use a different way. These are typically the things that change. And therefore, you will of course also see that in this course, I record a certain video with version, let's say 1.6, and you're viewing the course when the latest version is 1.9, but this does not mean that what you learn is not accurate anymore. Instead, this course is fully up to date and I will keep it up to date. And actually, I already did replace all the videos in the course once to improve the overall course quality and reflect a couple of important new features. I wouldn't have needed to do so because what I taught still was right. As I mentioned, it's not like everything changing all the time, but there were some things that could now be done in an easier way since I recorded my first version of this course when Flutter was still in beta. Now it's been stable for a while and therefore no large changes are to be expected, but whenever something does change or does need updating, I will keep this course up to date. And now that we have that out of the way, it's time to set up Flutter, set up the development environment for Flutter, and build our first little Flutter application. And as a side note, the next videos actually are from my first version of this course. Therefore, there you still see the beta version of Flutter. The setup hasn't changed a bit. The look of the website has changed a tiny bit, but the steps are the same, the result is the same. That's why I kept these videos around. They're 100% accurate. Nonetheless, but really keep this version thing in mind, and whenever something changes and doesn't work anymore, I will fix it and update it, no worries. So with that, let's build our first Flutter app and see how Flutter actually works and how we can build Flutter applications together. So let's install Flutter then. And the installation actually differs between Mac OS and Windows. For the rest of the course, the code we write and so on will be the same, but here for the installation it differs. So therefore, in this video, we'll set up Flutter and all the surrounding packages and dependencies we need for Mac, and in the next video, we'll do the same for Windows. So if you are a Windows user, you can simply skip this video, and if you are a Mac user, you can skip the next video. So let's proceed with the Mac setup then. On flutter.io, you can simply click on Get Started and then choose Install on Mac OS. By the way, if you're on Linux, the steps are pretty much the same, but you can also click on Install on Linux to see them in detail. And that's in general what I would recommend. Go through these steps in detail. The good thing is you can read them here. And I strongly recommend following along here and reading these whilst you also watch this video or whilst you are going through the installation process, because A, some tiny steps could change over time, and B, this is a great way of resolving issues since there might be something you overlook in the video which you can then simply read about in this article. So let's continue. First of all, let's check the system requirements. Well, we need the operating system Mac OS, obviously, enough free space on our disk, and then we depend on these command line tools, which actually should all be available by default. Now, Git might not be, so it's a good idea to download it before you get started. You can simply search for Git on Google and then actually pick that first or actually that second link to find the downloads page. And there simply choose Mac OS or Linux, depending on where you're on. And then the download should start automatically. If it doesn't, you can simply click here, obviously. And this will download an installer through which you can simply walk to install Git, which is a version management system, on your machine. Now, you don't need to use that version management system, but Flutter uses it behind the scenes. This is why you need to have this available. Once you got Git installed, with the help of that installer you can download, which I showed you a second ago, you can proceed with these steps. And the next step is to actually download Flutter. Now, at the point of time recording this, the latest version is 0.3.2 beta. Chances are that when you're watching this, there's a higher version available, but the code we write will still be the same. So download the latest version you're seeing here, of course. Now I'll go with this one. Simply download it to your machine. And this can take a while. As you can see, it's quite a big file. So I will jump forward to the point of time where this already is downloaded. The installation just finished for me. You can now simply unzip this, and you can do that with the command you see here, or simply, well, click on that downloaded file, simply open it in the folder where it was downloaded, simply click on it down there, and then unzip this. Now this can take a couple of seconds, of course, since it's a rather big file. Once it is unzipped, you have this Flutter folder, and now you should copy this somewhere where you want to store this. Now, this Flutter thing here is an entire tool set. It's the SDK, the software development kit you need for developing Flutter apps. It includes a lot of dependencies Flutter needs. So this is really a central package, a program you should store on your machine. And you can copy it wherever you want on your machine. Now I got that tools folder where I want to have it, so I'll just drag it over there. And now with Flutter added to that folder, we can proceed with, well, the installation or with using it. So the Flutter tool is actually a tool we execute from the command line. Therefore, we need to add it to our path. The path is basically a global variable which ensures that the Flutter program, or which ensures that any program, can be accessed through the command line. And we want to configure the Flutter program to be found there. Now, to be found there, we could execute this command in the command line if we navigated into the newly created Flutter folder, or we do something which is seen a little bit further down the article. Here, we update our path permanently. Now, how does that work? For that, you should go into your user folder, and there you need to turn on the setting to see hidden files. You should then see that bash profile file. Now you can simply open that with the normal text edit app or with any text editor of your choice. Now if you're using the text edit app, just make sure you're viewing this in plain text mode, not in rich text mode. So if you open this then, let me make this a bit bigger, you can edit this file. And this basically configures path settings for your terminal, for your command line tool on Mac or Linux. Now, we want to add something here. We want to add this line, which you can find in the installation steps. Simply add it at the bottom. And we need to replace this part here with the actual path, the folder path, on to that Flutter tool on our machine. Now, that of course depends on where you dragged it. For me, it can be found under users, then my username, then there's a development folder, and then there I created a tools folder. And again, you really have to pick your path there where you dragged that Flutter tool. You can view that also by clicking on get info here. Then you can see where it's found. In my case, users, my username, development, tools. With that, simply save that file and thereafter open your normal terminal app on Mac or Linux. Once you did open that, you should be able to run Flutter Doctor. Now, this is a tool which will also check if you need to do something to make Flutter work, and it should do something if you set up your Flutter installation correctly. By the way, the fact that my installation is 30 days old, we can ignore that here because we know we just downloaded the latest version, 0.3.2 in my case, so this is all fine. Now, this is already looking quite good here because I actually have a decent setup. I'll still walk you through the remaining steps here though. So we updated our path. We now ran Flutter Doctor 2. Now what we need to do is we need to configure our system to be able to build iOS and or Android apps. For that, if you want to build iOS apps, if you want to test your app on iOS and ultimately build it for that platform, you need to install Xcode, which is Apple's development IDE, but also an absolutely required tool for building iOS apps, even if you use Flutter and no native code for that. So install Xcode by downloading it from the Mac App Store. And once you got it installed, you need to make sure that you can use the so-called Xcode command line tools. And this can be done by simply copy and pasting this command into your terminal. So you can simply run this. You might be prompted to enter your password there. And then it might or might not do something, depending on whether you already configured this. It might prompt you to accept the license. Once you completed this step, you can continue to step number 3 and execute this command to accept the license agreements of Xcode build, which is the build tool we're going to use. Now here you can simply scroll to the bottom, which can be sped up by hitting space a couple of times, and then type agree down there. Now with that out of the way, we can continue and we can bring up the iOS simulator, which simply is an iPhone running on our machine. It can be started with this command. You could also start it from within the Xcode, by the way, but I will simply start it with this command, open-a simulator with a capital S. And now what this should do is it should bring up this iOS simulator here. Now this is the device running. You can change the type of phone you're emulating here from that menu, device, and then iOS, and then choose your favorite device here. And now with that up and running, what you can do is you can start your Flutter app by running flutter run in the command prompt. Now for that, we need a Flutter app though, right? Because right now we only installed Flutter, but we haven't set up a Flutter app, a new project. So let's quickly do that. And for that, you should first of all navigate into the folder where you want to create your Flutter app. Once you navigated into that folder where you want to create your new Flutter project, run flutter create and then the name. For example, first_app. Important, this project name must not contain dashes or white spaces. It should be using underscores instead, or be one word only. Hit enter, and this will now set up a new Flutter project in that specified location, a new subfolder which holds that project to be precise. Can take a couple of seconds. And once it's done, you can navigate into this newly created folder. In my case, it's named first_app, and then hit Flutter run. Enter this, hit enter, and with the iOS simulator up and running, you should be able to see that Flutter app on that iOS simulator momentarily. The first build or the first time you run this can take a couple of seconds longer, by the way. Here we are. Now important, keep that process running. Don't quit it. You could quit it with Control-C, but you want to keep that running so that you can always rebuild your project and instantly ship that new version to the device whenever you change something in your code. So with that, you should see this, your first Flutter app running on the iPhone. And you can hit that plus button to see a counter that is incremented. This is an app the Flutter tool created for you. We, of course, didn't write any code yet. Now that's cool. And we will actually edit this a little bit to see how we can, well, work with that first Flutter app. But obviously, we also want to build for Android, right? So let's go back to these installation docs. We're done with the iOS setup here, the simulator at least. Now, if you want to deploy to a real iOS device, you can follow these steps here. You will essentially need to plug in your real iPhone, then also again execute these steps to install Homebrew, and then these extra tools which you need to be able to ship your app to a real iPhone. And once you're done with that, you can continue with these steps, and you will need to do some tweaking in Xcode to be able to ship your app to your real device. Now that is something I'll come back to later in this course when we will actually test this on a real device and also deploy the app at the end. But again, feel free to already go through these steps. They're really simple if you want to run this on a real device. Now I'll move on to Android for now. And for that, we will need Android Studio. Just like Xcode is the official IDE and contains all the build tools for iOS apps, Android Studio is the same for Android. So click that link to be forwarded to the download page of Android Studio. And on that page, it should automatically present you the macOS download. So you can simply hit download Android Studio here, accept these license agreements, and well, then download. Store this in any folder of your choice. And this again is a little bit of a bigger file. So let's wait for this to finish before we continue. Now the download did finish. You can then simply execute that file and it will launch an installer for you. Let me also close the iOS simulator here. Now that Android Studio installer is pretty straightforward on Mac. Just drag that into that applications folder. And this will copy or install that tool in that folder, which again will take a couple of seconds since it also unpacks that folder. And once you are done with that, let's go back to the Flutter installation page. Once you're done with that, you need to start Android Studio and go through the setup wizard to configure everything and install everything you need. Now you could also be getting a security warning that the opening of Android Studio was blocked because it was from an from the internet, not from an identified developer. You can then open it anyways through the Mac security and privacy settings. And ultimately, this should bring up this setup wizard. Now click Next on the first screen, click Custom on the next screen, Next again. Now here you can choose your editor theme. If you want to have the light or the dark one. You don't need to use Android Studio as an editor for this course, and actually I won't, but you can. So I'll go with Darkula here, but that is totally up to you. Now on the next screen, make sure to also check Android Virtual Device here under the installation options. The default installation path then should be all right. Click Next and Finish. And now this will download a bunch of things and install all the SDKs and tools you need to develop Android apps. And these will be used behind the scenes by Flutter, which is why we need them. So let me fast forward until this is also done. Now, by the way, this can take a couple of minutes, so don't worry if it takes a bit longer. It downloads and installs quite a lot of things. Now the setup finished for me here, so let's click Finish. And thereafter, you can click on Open an existing Android Studio project. Now there, simply navigate to the folder where you just created your new Flutter app. In my case, that's that first_app folder. Select the whole folder and click Open. And this will bring up Android Studio with that project opened. Now, when you open it for the first time, it will actually scan that folder. So let's wait for this to finish. And it should actually suggest you two things. Down there, it finds something about a plugin. And there you can simply expand this and click on Configure Plugins. It actually also shows you something about the Dart files. We ignore this for now. So now choose that Flutter plugin and click OK. And thereafter, click Yes to also install that Dart plugin for which it's asking up there. And thereafter, simply restart. Now, once you restart it, you may get a message at the bottom here regarding IDE and plugin updates. If you don't, that's fine too. In my case, I do get one. So I'll simply update now to install the latest versions of all the SDKs and build tools I might need. And that again will get downloaded, which again will take a couple of seconds. And now with all of that done, let me click Finish here. And now this is our Flutter project. Now I will open this in a different IDE where it's also a bit easier to read in a second. For now, we won't work on that code here. Instead, let's run this on an emulator. For that, we can simply go to Tools and then AVD Manager. That stands for Android Virtual Device. Let's open that tool. And here I actually got some pre-configured devices. You should at least have one that Nexus or some other device which is created with the installation. You can always create a new virtual device by clicking that button here at the bottom. And then you can choose which device you want to use. Let's say the Pixel 2. Continue, choose your API version. Now, typically the highest one is a good choice, or the one selected by default, I should say, not necessarily the cutting edge one, but this one. Click Next again. Now here on emulated performance, you should choose the hardware emulation for a faster emulator. The other settings should be fine. Simply hit Finish, and this should create that new emulator. And you can then start it by clicking on that play button on the very right here. Now this will bring up your Android emulator. Now we can of course use that emulator to run our Flutter app there too. And to run it, what we need to do is we need to go back to that command line where we previously already ran it on the iPhone and repeat that Flutter run command. If you still got the old one running, which you probably don't have if you shut down the old simulator, you can always quit the running process with Ctrl+C. So let's hit Flutter Run to run it on our Android emulator once that emulator did boot up. And it will build the project with the help of the Android SDK that was installed together with the Android Studio. And that first build process can again take a couple of seconds. Subsequent ones will be faster. And now it should be up and running. Let's view it. And there it is. This is our device and this is our Flutter app. And we can click the plus button to increment this counter. Awesome. So this is how we install Flutter and run it on both the iOS and Android emulators. Now, if you want to run it on real devices, you can follow the steps outlined in the documentation, but of course, we'll also run it together on a real device later in this course. For now, let's focus on the editor with which we're going to work on this code. I will not use the Android Studio editor, though you can absolutely do that. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a fully fledged IDE with the Flutter plugin. You can work in it, and if you want to use that, you can follow along through the entire course with that IDE without problems. I'll quit it though, because I have another IDE which I like more, and that's Visual Studio Code. You install it from codevisualstudio.com, and it's a free IDE, just like Android Studio. It should automatically present you the right download option for Mac. And you can simply, well, download it then. And once you did download it, you will have a file which you can execute and which will walk you through the installer. The installation should be pretty straightforward. There's nothing special on it or nothing tricky on it. Once you did install Visual Studio, you can open it, run it. And then in the starting screen, simply choose Open Folder or choose File Open to open your Flutter project. So that is what I'll do. Open that first app folder. And this will now open Flutter in, well, that IDE. Now, I will actually use this IDE and also this look of the IDE, which is the dark theme. You can change the look under Code, Preferences, Color Themes. But I will install some extra extensions to make working with Flutter a bit more pleasant. And that extension can be added by going to View, Extensions, or using that shortcut, or using that sidebar you will probably see here on the left. Extensions are simply add-ons to Visual Studio Code, which let us enhance the coding experience. And there you should simply search for Flutter to find the official Flutter plugin or extension. Click Install there, and this will also install the Dart extension as a dependency. Once you did install it, you can hit Reload to reload Visual Studio Code with that extension added. And there's one extra extension I will use throughout the course, which is totally optional, and that's the Material Icon theme. Now that's not related to Flutter, it just makes the icons look nicer. I already got it installed. You can install it from this page. And once you did install that, but more important, the Flutter one, you can switch back to the Explorer here with that shortcut or by clicking in the menu. And you're back in your project structure, and now you're well prepared to work with Flutter. And for example, here in our main Dart file, we can manipulate our first app by, for example, going down to the increment counter method here and changing that counter ++ thing to counter equals counter +2. This should now increase the counter by 2 on every click. Now the very cool thing is you can hit save here and then go back to your command prompt where you ran Flutter run and simply hit R with that Flutter run process running. So don't quit it. Hit R whilst it is running and it will hot reload your Flutter app, which means it will reload it on the fly on the emulator without the need to rebuild it. If that gets stuck somehow, you can press Shift R for a full rebuild and reload, still with that process running. So let's go back to our app, and it looks like nothing changed. We even have the old counter. But if we click the plus now, it increases by 2. And that's already showing how cool it is to work with Flutter and how easy it is to develop with it, with that hot reloading. And this also is the setup I will use throughout the course. And I will teach you all about Flutter, Dart, and some tricks with the IDE throughout this course. Now let's see how that works for Windows, or if that doesn't matter to you because you're using Mac only, let's continue with the course and dive deeper into Flutter. In the last video, we installed Flutter for Mac. Now, if you're using Windows, let's now install it for Windows too. If you're using Mac only, you can therefore skip this video. So, to install Flutter on Windows, first of all, let's visit flutter.io, click on Get Started there, and then choose Install on Windows. There you will see all the installation steps in detail, and I strongly recommend also going through these step by step along with the video. Because for one, they can change in one or the other detail in the future. And then this is great to see, or easy to see in that written form. And additionally, it's easy to miss a step. And therefore, this is a great companion for this video. So first of all, let's have a look at the system requirements. We install Flutter on our machine. We need Windows 7 or higher, the disk space, which is mentioned here, and important, one of these two tools, PowerShell or Git for Windows. Now, Git is a versioning system, and even if you don't use it actively, Flutter does use it. So here, I'll install Git for Windows by clicking on that link. Then we have the chance to download that Git tool from that Git page here. It should automatically give you the right download for your machine. Download it, and then walk through the installer. Now, in the installer, you can choose the place where you want to install Git, then simply hit Next and, well, install that tool. Now, very important, you click Next a couple of times, and most of the default settings are fine. One important thing to note is that on this screen here, you should use Git from the Windows command prompt. Don't use one of the other two options, use the middle one here. This is also mentioned in the official docs. Now with that, hit Next a couple of times and leave all the other defaults. And with all that, simply hit Next one last time and it will install Git on your machine. And with that, you're fine. You can now close this and continue in these setup instructions. The next step is to actually install the Flutter SDK, which you can get from this download link here. Now important, the version of Flutter, of course, will change in the future. Right now it's 0.3.2.beta. It's production ready already, and the code you learn in this course will still be all correct in the future, even if you are downloading a different version, but make sure to download the version you're seeing here. So whatever version that is for you. So this will now also be downloaded. Will take a couple of seconds since it's quite a big file. And once it is downloaded, you can extract this folder into the place where you want to install that Flutter tool. Now important, the Flutter tool is not your project for your mobile app. It's a SDK, a software development kit, which you install globally on your machine and which you will use from different places on your machine to create new Flutter projects and to work with the ones you created. So to build them, to run them on an emulator, things like that. So unzip Flutter into that directory. Now, one important note about the directory you're storing your Flutter files in, make sure it's a directory where you don't need elevated permissions, so administration permissions, to run files in. Or you have an account where you always have admin permissions. That would be alternative. Then it doesn't matter where you install it, just as I'm doing it here. I do have admin rights, so no problem here. But if you have only rights for your user, make sure you store the Flutter installation somewhere in your user directory on Windows. So in a subfolder of your user directory or directly on the root level of your user directory. Don't store it in program files or any partition where you would need administrative rights to work with the files or to run the executable. So make sure to store it in your user folder instead if you're facing any issues or if you don't have administration rights by default. And once you unzipped it, you can go into that directory, and in my case here, I'll also move all the files up one folder so that they're all directly in the Flutter folder. And then you can execute that flutter console.bat file here. Now this will open up a command prompt which already uses Flutter. And you could stop here and continue with the Flutter commands and with bringing up your Android emulator and so on, and always open that tool here to run the Flutter commands which you need to run or build your app. However, I want to be able to use the normal command prompt. So let's close the Flutter console here. And let's move on and make sure that we can use the Flutter commands from the normal Windows command prompt. For that, we'll need to update our path. Now, the path, that simply is a global variable which Windows uses to find the tools we can use from the command line. And since we picked a custom folder where we installed Flutter, or where we unpacked it to, we need to make Windows aware of where that is. You do that by opening your control panel and then going to user accounts, and there simply click on change my environment variables. Now in the window which opens, you should find a path entry which you can select and where you then can click edit. Now here you can add new locations of tools you want to be able to execute to that path by clicking on new here. And then here you need to enter the path to your Flutter folder, so the folder you unpacked. Simply go into your Windows Explorer and there navigate into the bin subfolder, to be precise, that is what you need. Copy the path to that bin subfolder and add it to your path variable by clicking new, adding it to that empty blank space which opens up, and thereafter hitting OK. Now you're prepared to run Flutter commands from the normal command prompt. Click OK and make sure to close any command prompts you might have opened already. Restart Windows if you're facing issues thereafter. And once you did all that, you can bring up the normal command prompt and simply enter Flutter there. Now, this might show you a warning regarding the installation being a bit older. You can ignore that because we actually did just install the latest version, so that will be all right. But the fact that you're seeing this and not something like Flutter not recognized means that we did successfully add it to our path and that we can use that Flutter command line tool from our command prompt. Now, Flutter is now available. The next step we have to do is we have to set up Android Studio. This is the official SDK provided by Google for building Android apps. And whilst we will not write native code with it, it includes all the SDKs and build tools Flutter will need too. So simply go to developer.android.com/studio or use the link you find in the Flutter installation documentation and download the Android Studio version there. It should automatically give you the right version for your operating system. You need to accept the agreement before you can continue. And with that, the download will start, and it will also take a while since it's also quite a big download. So let me fast forward to the point where this is done. Now, once the download did finish, simply execute the, executable you got, and the installer will start. Now there you can continue. Make sure to choose Android Virtual Device as a component you want to install though. That's important that you tick that. Thereafter, you can choose the location where you want to install Android Studio, and you can use the default here or pick your own location on your machine. And then you can simply hit next. Now this will again take a couple of seconds. And once it's done, you can start the Android Studio. And for the first time you start it, a wizard will come up, which allows you to configure it. Now in that wizard, hit next, and then choose custom here. And the next step is that you can choose your UI theme. Now that's mostly important if you want to use Android Studio to build your Flutter apps, which you can. However, I will use a different IDE in this course. And I will go with the dark theme here, but of course you can choose your favorite look. In the next step, it's important that you check Android Virtual Device, that this option is ticked, because we will need to be able to bring up such virtual devices. With that ticked, choose your Android SDK location, use the default or create your own path, and thereafter simply hit Next. Now, this will install a couple of things, and you can start the installation by hitting Finish here. This will actually take quite long because it downloads and installs a lot of packages, so don't worry if this takes a couple of minutes, maybe even 20 minutes or something like this, and I will be back once it's done for me. Once the installation did finish, you can, well, close the installer and then bring up Android Studio again. Now here, you can open an existing Android Studio project, which would be your Flutter app you're working on, but we don't have such an app yet. So our next step actually is to create such an app. However, we will need an emulator to view it. So let's make sure we fulfill all requirements for that. You can see them here in the official docs. And by the way, if you want to install your app on a real device, that is something we'll also do later in the course. And you can, of course, already go through the steps you see here if that's important to you right now already. But again, we'll do this together later in the course. For the majority of the course, we will work on the emulator though. So there on the emulator, you see that it's important that we have hardware acceleration enabled on our machine. Click that link to learn more about it and see how to turn it on. And thereafter, we can go back to Android Studio, and now we need that Flutter project to continue. So back to the command prompt. There, you should now navigate into the folder where you want to create your new Flutter project. You can navigate around in Windows with the cd command to change the directory you're in the command prompt. Now make sure to create a folder and navigate into that folder where you want to store your Flutter app. And once you're in that folder, you can create a new Flutter application and project by running flutter create and then the name of your project. Now important, that name must not contain a dash or something like that, also not a white space. Words should be separated with underscores, or you simply use one word only. So flutter create first underscore app is my command here to create this project. And now this will add a new folder in the location you're in the command prompt and configure your first Flutter project in there. As you can see, it creates a couple of files. And once it's done with all that, you can open the project in Android Studio by clicking on Open an existing Android Studio project. And there you should navigate to that folder you just created and open it there in the Flutter folder in my case. So basically open that project you just created, first underscore app in my case. This will open it in Android Studio. And before we do anything there, let's bring up that virtual device. You can do that by, in Android Studio, going to Tools and then AVD Manager, which stands for Android Virtual Device Manager. And in the window, which then opens up, you can start a new virtual device by clicking on to Create Virtual Device. You should also have one by default, which you can use, but let me show you how to create a new one. There you choose your blueprint, basically regarding the general hardware and layout profile. I'll go with the Pixel 2 here. On the next screen, you choose the image, the Android version you want to use. And I recommend not going with the cutting edge version, but using the latest stable version. In my case, Oreo API level 27. Typically, that's the one which is selected by default. Hit Next again. Now on the next screen, make sure to choose hardware acceleration from the graphics drop down there. And you can have a look at the advanced settings, but you typically don't need to change these. And with that all done, you can finish that and create that new virtual device. Now with it created, you can start it by clicking on that play button on the right. And this will open the virtual device on your screen. It will bring up an Android phone on your machine, so to say. Now, with that running, we can't run our Flutter app yet because we still need to do some things. For one, we need to install the missing dependencies, the missing plugins. For that, click on Install Plugins here at the top where it tells you about the missing Dart plugin. You could, by the way, also skip this if you already installed a Flutter plugin, but here I do it in 2 separate steps. So install that Dart plugin. Once the installer is done, you need to restart Android Studio. And once you restart it, you should actually get a message here at the bottom where it suggests you a new plugin. Expand that message and click on Configure Plugins. And there, it will suggest the Flutter plugin. Simply accept this by clicking OK, and now it will install the Flutter plugin too. And that would have installed the Dart plugin with it, so you can actually do that in one step only. And once this is done, you need to restart the IDE one more time. So let's do that. Let's restart the IDE again. And now we have Android Studio configured to support Flutter. Now, we still don't see our emulator here at the top, and therefore we still can't start our application. Let's quit the emulator for now. And to make it work, first of all, go back to the setup instructions and make sure to install that Google USB driver. Now, that should only be important for running it on a real device, but it still doesn't hurt to set it up already so that it will work later. So click on that link you see there and install the USB driver. You can do that from within Android Studio by going back into it. And there, going to Tools, SDK Manager. And in the SDK Manager, go to SDK Tools and choose Google USB driver there. Hit OK thereafter or apply and install it. You also need to accept the license agreements there. Now, with it installed, you will need to also do one more thing if you installed your Android SDK in a different place on your operating system than the one suggested during the wizard, which I did. You need to add one other environment variable. You can also see that if you go back to the command prompt and run Flutter Doctor, a tool which tells you what's missing. Here it tells me that it's unable to locate the Android SDK. And therefore, I will go back to my control panel and there to user accounts, and then change my environment variables. And first of all, we need to add a brand new variable. So click New here and then name that variable. And the name is important, Android_home, all uppercase. Make sure to not add a typo here. Now, with that name defined, you need to define a value, and that simply is a path pointing to the Android SDK. You can click Browse Directory here to choose the Android SDK location, and there simply choose the location you selected during the wizard or in the wizard which opened or which ran when you opened Android Studio. In my case, it's the Android folder. It should be this folder which has a platforms, emulator, and so on subfolder. Simply hit OK with the root folder selected, and now you also need to add something to your path variable. So select that again and click on Edit, and there you need to add two new entries. The first one should be %, and then Android home, so that variable name you just created, written exactly in the same way, and then another %, \tools, and then you need to add one other entry, which is also %, Android home, \platform tools. Make sure it's written exactly as you see it here in the video. Now, with that added, hit OK and restart the command prompt. And now also restart your virtual device by quitting it, potentially wiping the user data if you're facing issues restarting it, and then hitting the green play button again. This will bring up the emulator again. And now you should see it here in the drop-down selected. And now you can press that Run button to run your Flutter app on that virtual device. Now, this build process, which will start it on the device, can take a couple of minutes when you run it the first time. Don't worry about that. And once it's done, you should see your Flutter app running on that emulator. And you can hit the plus button here to increment the counter. Pretty awesome. Our Flutter app finally running on an emulator. And of course, we'll change this app soon. Now, as I mentioned, I won't use Android Studio as an editor here. And therefore, I also want to show you a way of running this without Android Studio. You can do that by going to the command prompt, navigating into the folder where you have your first app or into this project folder you created. And in there, you can run Flutter run. And this will now do the exact same as you did with the command inside, or with the click of the button inside Android Studio, but without you doing it through Android Studio. It will build the app and ship it to your emulator and run it there. And this is actually how I will run my apps for the rest of this course, since I won't use Android Studio. You can use either approach, however, using Flutter Run will have advantages like the hot reloading I'll introduce in a second. Now, which editor will I use then? I will use Visual Studio Code. You can get it from code.visualstudio.com. It's a free IDE, which also has an extension that provides awesome Flutter support. You can download it from that page, and it will automatically give you the right version for your operating system. And you can simply walk through the installer. It's pretty straightforward, nothing special about it. Simply install the IDE on your machine. Now, once you did install it in your favorite location, you can start it. And in the IDE, you can then click Open Folder or choose the Open option from the File menu in the top left corner and simply choose that first _app folder you created. Now, this is your Flutter app. And in order to be able to work with that really well, we should add a so-called extension. So a plugin we can add to that IDE to add extra functionalities. You can install extensions by clicking on this icon on the left or selecting View Extensions in the menu at the top. And there simply search for Flutter. Install that extension you find here. It's the official Flutter extension. And it will also install the Dart extension together with it, because that will be a dependency. And once it is installed, you just need to restart the IDE to have that installed. Now, I will use one extra extension throughout the course, and that's the material icon theme. That is not related to Flutter development. I just like the icon look I get with it. It's totally optional. I just want to show it here so that you don't wonder why my icons look different than the default icons. Once you install that, if you want it, you again can reload the IDE. And with that, we can finally make a change to our Flutter code after I activated that new theme. You can see your Flutter code in the lib folder of the project you opened. And there in the main.dart file, you see the code which is responsible for the app which is currently running on the emulator. There, search the increment counter, the _increment counter method, and in set state, change _counter ++ to _counter equals _counter +2. This should ensure that we actually increase the counter by 2 every time we hit the plus, not by 1 anymore. With that change made, go back to the command prompt and make sure that the Flutter run process is still running. Don't quit it. You could quit it with Ctrl+C, but as long as you are developing, you should keep it running, because then you can hit R with that process running to hot reload your app, which means the changes you added are pushed into the app without the need for it to rebuild. Now, sometimes this fails. Then you can press Shift-R to do a full reload and a full rebuild. And you can quit that process with Ctrl+C if you're done with development for the day. So I pressed R, and if I go back to my emulator here, you can see that I can now increment by 2 instead of 1. And this is our first little change. We will do much more, of course, but this is our Windows setup finished. Was quite a lot of work, but now we are prepared to continue and dive much deeper into Flutter, of course. In the first app, you already saw it, and throughout this course you will see it. Flutter by default embraces the material design system, the material design language. Material design looks like this as an example, and it's a design system created and heavily used by Google. Now, it's not Google style for everyone though. It's highly customizable and works on iOS devices too, so you can also use it in your iOS apps. And whilst material design is built into Flutter, you also find Apple-styled widgets in the Flutter framework which you can use. And in this course, I will show you both. I will show you how to build apps that look like the typical material design application, I will show you how to set up your own look, so neither material design, not iOS style, and I will also show you how you can get that iOS look with the so-called Cupertino widgets, which Flutter also offers. So here again, Flutter gives you full flexibility regarding how your app should look like, and in this course I'll cover all the different options and show you how you build different kinds of apps. For the majority, I'll use the built-in material design widgets, but you will learn how you could deviate from this as well. We're nearing the end of this module, and you can skip this video here if React Native and Ionic doesn't tell you anything. These are simply alternatives to using Flutter, at least in a certain way. Flutter is not the only tool, the only approach that allows you to build iOS and Android apps with one programming language and with one project code base. There are other solutions too, also besides React Native and Ionic. There, for example, also is NativeScript and so on. But React Native and Ionic are probably the biggest competitors to Flutter. And I just want to show some examples on where Flutter differs from them. So why would you use Flutter and not React Native or Ionic? Now let's see how each of these approaches works. Flutter uses Dart and the Flutter framework, and Dart is a programming language developed by Google. React Native, on the other hand, uses JavaScript and the React library, and Ionic uses just JavaScript and any or no framework at all that you want. And by the way, I also do have courses on React Native and Ionic in case you want to have a look at that. Now the result of Flutter is that you get compiled native apps, so you get real native apps compiled for the target platforms. For React Native, that's pretty much the same, but I wrote partly compiled here because the apps are compiled to native apps, but there also are parts in your code, in your JavaScript code, which is actually not compiled, but which is basically enclosed in the native app and runs as JavaScript in the native app instead of as compiled code. And that's different for Flutter. There, all the code is compiled and runs as native machine code, therefore. And for Ionic, nothing is compiled. There, you actually have a web app, which is wrapped inside of a native app. So you still get a native app, which you can publish to the app stores, but it's just a wrapper around your web app. Now, the advantage of this Ionic approach is that you can use normal web technologies, and if you're a web developer, it's particularly easy to create such apps, and you can use all your normal web development skills to build cross-platform apps there. Downside of this wrapped approach, of course, could be performance. Now, for Flutter, it's also important to understand that we don't compile to iOS or Android UI components, but that Flutter gives you an app that controls the entire screen and every pixel on it. For React Native, that's different. There you do compile to iOS and Android UI components. So the parts of the React Native app that are compiled is in the end the user interface, and there, for example, if you render a button, it is compiled to the native iOS button for iOS and to the native Android button for Android, which means you have less customization possibilities because, for example, if you can't add a drop shadow to the native iOS button, you can't add it to the React Native button because that's compiled to the iOS button. For Flutter, since it controls every pixel on its own, you can style it in whichever way you want, or Flutter lets you at least, because the native button restrictions don't matter to Flutter. Now for Ionic, there is no compilation to native equivalents. Instead, you have a web app, so you can style a button as you could style it in any web app. It's not compiled to a native button. Now with Flutter, you can build cross-platform apps, mobile apps, and actually even web apps and desktop apps, though as long as that's in very early stages, it'll not be part of the course. I do cover it once it is more stable though. For React Native, it's pretty much only about mobile apps, though there is a project, an unofficial project if you will, which allows you to use your React Native app also to get a web app as a result. For Ionic, you by default, since you build a web app that's wrapped by a native app, you by default have a web app as well, right? So you also have full cross-platform support. You can get a mobile app with this wrapped approach. You have a web app anyways, and you can also build a desktop app by wrapping it around this web app, so to say, with a tool named Electron. Now, who's working on these projects? Flutter is developed by Google, React Native is developed by Facebook, and Ionic is developed by a company which is called Ionic, and therefore they all have big companies backing them, especially React Native and Flutter, of course, but also the Ionic company is earning its money with the Ionic framework. And therefore, regarding the future, all three should be very stable and under active development for a long time. So that shouldn't influence your choice. What should influence your choice then? Well, for Flutter, there you have the great advantage that you have real native apps, so you get great performance. No web view wrapped app, which automatically has a bit worse performance because of that wrapping. Instead, you have meshing code, which is running, and that gives you a great performance. And because Flutter controls every pixel on the screen, you also have a high flexibility. You have a lot of control over your app. Now, some people also might not like this approach of not having the platform primitives, but instead have Flutter control everything, because you could argue that it's therefore harder to get the default Android and iOS look and that it requires a bit more work from your side to get the look. But that's up to you to decide. I think the higher customization possibilities actually aren't too bad and are a nice advantage. But in the end, that's of course up to your personal preference. React Native and Ionic are certainly nice alternatives, and that's why I do have courses in all of them. And attached to this lecture, you actually find a link to an article and a video which I created where I compare these alternatives and dig a bit deeper into the details of these approaches and give you a more detailed comparison. As a first summary here, Flutter is a great choice, of course, because you have real compiled apps, and with every pixel controlled by Flutter, you have a lot of flexibility and high performance. So now it's really time to get started with Flutter and learn all about its details. We're pretty much done getting started. In the next course module, we'll dive into all the important basics of Flutter, and you will learn all about how Flutter works, the core widgets there, how you build user interfaces with the widgets, and so on. So that will be a crucial module, of course. Thereafter, we'll dive into debugging, because of course things can go wrong during development, and finding and fixing errors is an important part of being a developer. So we'll have a look at how that works in the debugging section. Before we then have a section where we dive deeper into the basics, if you will, dive deeper into available widgets, into how to style and customize your widgets, how to add more logic to your application, and in general, build more realistic applications. Now, it is worth mentioning that all of these concepts are not just taught in boring theory, but that we build full apps, and not just one app throughout the entire course, but we do have an app for the basics section, we do have a different app for the more widget section, and throughout the course we'll have a couple of applications, some apps only for one section, some apps which are used by multiple sections to show different concepts. This also gives you the advantage that if you come back to the course after a while, or you want to skip certain sections, you don't miss a large chunk of a project we're working on. Instead, many sections have their own projects, and therefore it's easier to get into them. Now, after having a closer look at styling and building more realistic widgets, you will also learn how to build responsive and adaptive user interfaces. Responsive simply means that you have user interfaces that look good on different device sizes. Adaptive means that your user interface adapts to the underlying platform, so to Android or iOS, and for example renders different widgets or a different layout if you want to. After that, you'll have a solid understanding of the core foundations of Flutter, of the fundamentals if you want to call it like that. And therefore we'll then dig deeper into the internals. We'll have a look at how Flutter and its widgets work internally, how the app is re-rendered when something changes, and how you can optimize your code to improve the performance and improve how your app works. With that out of the way, it's time for a new app and a brand new topic: navigation in multiple screens. Up to this point in the course, we'll always have worked on one screen only, but most apps have more than one screen. You might have a product screen and a card screen and a user profile screen, and here you will learn how to set up different screens and how to navigate between them so that you can switch pages in your app. It's around that time that we will also see that for bigger apps, it can get pretty cumbersome to manage the data correctly, the data our app or the different parts of our app needs. And therefore, we'll then have a look at state management. This is a super important course module where we will dive into the different options you have when it comes to managing data and state, which is in the end just a different term for data that changes, you could say. how you can manage that in bigger applications, how you can pass it around effectively, how you can make sure that when something changes in a certain place in your app, all places that depend on it are updated efficiently. And we'll have a thorough look at this in this module, and for this we'll also start a brand new project, just as we did in the navigation and multiple screens section. We'll then build up on that and dive into how you can manage user input and forms, so how you can fetch email addresses or URLs or numbers and have the user enter such data, before we then learn how to connect our Flutter app to the web. Because up to this point we always just worked on the device, but some data needs to be stored in a database in the web, and therefore here you will learn how to reach out to the web, how to reach out to such a database and store your data there or get it from there. Now most applications also need some form of authentication, and therefore it's then time to dive into user authentication and learn how you can log users in, sign them up, log them out, and manage their session across the lifetime of your app. Really important for many applications, of course. After that, we'll have a look at animations. Animations are a crucial part of applications because they allow you to give the user a better feedback regarding what changed on the screen. And you will learn all about the built-in animation techniques Flutter offers and how you can use them to create great user experiences and user interfaces. Now, most native apps also need access to certain device features like the camera, maps, on-device storage, things like that. And therefore, this is also something we'll have a thorough look at in this module then. We'll again build a brand new application for this module here, and you will learn how to use the device camera, take an image, store that image, how to store it on the device, and also how to use Google Maps or get the user's location. Now, sometimes you need some native device feature which isn't built into Flutter, where you have no easy way of accessing it through Flutter. Now, for camera and maps that is built in, but maybe you have some use case where it's not built in. Well, then you will also learn how you can run native device code, so Java code for Android, for example, or Swift code for iOS, how you can run such code and connect it to your Flutter app so that you still have one project, but in case it's missing, it's not built into Flutter, you can actually run native device code triggered from inside your Flutter app. That's a really cool feature, and we'll cover this in this course as well. Now, once all of that is done, it's of course time to publish the app. And I will show you how you can build and optimize your app and then publish it to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store. Well, and with that we're done. I'll then round up the course, show you some next steps on how you can continue, and actually also give you a blueprint, you could say, for how you can develop great apps, which different phases are involved, and what my recommendations regarding that are. So definitely check that out as well. So as you can tell, there's a bunch of content in this course. I hope you'll like it. We have a bunch of apps we're building, and by the end of the course, you should therefore feel really confident to build amazing Flutter any app you want with the help of Flutter. So now that you know what's inside of the course, let's dive into how you can get the most out of it. So of course you should watch the videos. It's a video on demand course after all. Watch them at your speed, pause and rewind if I'm going too fast. I try to find the right balance for everyone, but if you feel like I'm too fast, slow me down or pause and go back to the start of the video again, because you should also code along and do the exercises. And sometimes that means that you have to pause the video so that you can code along. That's okay. Some students don't code along, which is why I don't have super long pauses in my video, since I want to create a good course for these students as well. But my recommendation really would be that you do code along, because that is how you learn the most. And also do the quizzes you find in the course, some exercises I have in there. Do all of that. Build your apps, build your own versions of my apps, because that is how you ultimately learn the most. Use all the course resources you find attached. That's my source code, which you can compare to yours if you're facing any errors. And also, of course, check out the different slides and cheat sheets I attach to various lectures in the course, since that can be really helpful, or it can be really helpful resources if you're coming back to this course after a while, or if you're working on your own projects. Now, if you're getting stuck and you did compare my code to yours, which you should always do first, you can of course also ask in the Q&A section. I'm trying my best to help you there, but I really can only help on questions that are directly related to the course and to the course code. And I urge you to compare your code to mine first before you ask, because most errors can simply be fixed by comparing code, and you learn much more if you can find and fix an error on your own than when I tell you and you maybe don't really understand what was wrong. And besides asking in the Q&A section, also help others, because you learn the most if you dig into problems, be that your own problems or the problems of others, and you solve them. And you have to write down an answer, and you have to think about the problem, and if your answer is correct. Of course, you might answer in a wrong way, but that's not a problem. You'll get corrected and you'll learn again. But if you try solving problems, be that your own ones or the problems of other students, you will learn so much more, because you really have to think about a problem and find a solution. And that is what makes you a great developer. So definitely take this opportunity to get the most out of this course.